introduction. Thank you so much, Walter. Yeah, that was a lovely introduction, and I only hope that I can live up to that because I think that was pretty lively and sung a lot of praises, so hopefully I'm able to pull through. Thank you so much. And also I wanted to point out, I was waylaid from coming down 6 months ago because of that which shall not be named, but also when I was updating my work for today, which hopefully will be shown soon, I realized we were also sharing this over Zoom pretty much a year ago, January 17th, 2021, I guess that is. So I'm so glad that we're all together now in person and able to have a meeting together and share this information together in person. So it's really exciting. And for those of you who were at the last presentation at Zoom, you know, when we were all in our own spaces, you'll see some things that are familiar. There's definitely a lot of elements that we'll be talking about again today that we talked about last year, but there's an addition of materials as well, in addition of some different angles related to the overall kind of framework for analysis of preservation in Vermont. And then also, since we're together, I would really love to have more questions, comments, interaction, and we can do that, you know, during the presentation, or we can do it after in terms of sharing things. I also had some ideas to sort of talk about the future of preservation in Fairhaven and sort of ways that the community can come together around preservation at the end. So hopefully we can have a really interactive presentation, and feel free to ask questions whenever during my presentation. Also, speaking of expertise, I am an architectural historian. In some ways, I actually call myself sort of historian heavy in the architectural historian realm. I'm very interested in the sort of stories and narratives of how things developed, how places developed. In some ways, the architectural component for me is a little secondary. I mean, I won't say secondary. I'll say the story really fascinates me. So that's sort of my element of the presentation today, is talking about the physical dimensions of the building, but really talking about the story. But I also want to say, in terms of expertise, you know, I am from Craftsbury Common, which is pretty much as far north as you can go before Canada in Orleans County. So my area of expertise, while I do have a knowledge base that extends down to Fairhaven, you all are really the experts of Fairhaven and its environs. So if there's something you'd like to add on to, if there's a correction that you'd like to make, if there's more context you'd like to add, please do, because, you know, while I do come in with my background of architectural history, you're historians and students of this area. So I think that's really important to remember. I think, how are we looking in terms of tech prognosis? Okay, wonderful. I'll go back to my initial slides, but I'll give a little bit of a sort of where we're going, just so we go through that, and then I'll go back, because a lot of this presentation's very material heavy in terms of photos and the records, because a little bit of it is a story of how do we do this research and how do we develop this story. So we'll be looking at a lot of images together and some of the material I used in my work. We're going to jump into the project background. We all know that this project was not initiated by a happy event. While I was very eager and excited to do the work, the day I came down to do documentation, the house was beginning to be taken apart and prepped for demolition. So it was a very troubling context, although I'm so glad I got to do the work. So we'll talk about that background a bit. We'll talk about the overview development context. I mean, obviously this building has a long narrative of development. I mean, we're talking circa 1800. I can't really drill in. I would imagine it's 1790s to 1800. So we have a long span of development through 2021. Or is it 2020? My years are totally blending together now. What? 20? All right, we'll solve that when I can have my PowerPoint and look at it. We'll talk about the spaces and layers of the Red House, because, you know, obviously there was a lot of material integrity to this property, but there were also a lot of changes over time and layers over time. And as we've talked about before, this is actually a really special component of the house. You had successive families making this house their own, and I think that's an important part of the story. And actually we have someone who lived in the house for how many years?
8 years, almost
8 years, exactly. So you could tell us a lot of, you know, stories about the house as well.
This is my daughter.
Yeah, and are you the one who did the...
Met on the yard of the house.
Yeah, and are you the one who did the painting, your daughter? I almost put that painting in the PowerPoint today, and then I was like, oh, the colors of my background in this, it's not gonna... So we'll talk about that, the layers. And then I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about community-based preservation strategies. You know, how do we try to avoid being in that position again, right? I mean, that was a horrible position for people in the town of Fairhaven to be in, to feel like there was no recourse of, you know, this destructive event. So thinking about that. And not to put you on the spot, Devin, but I think it's really great that we have our state architectural historian, Devin Coleman, in attendance today. And so I'm hoping that we can maybe talk a little bit with you about some of those strategies and big picture. Great. Thank you. And this was, I think, my fault, because I rolled in here 15 minutes early, so I should have come earlier. I apologize. So anyway, we have it up on the screen. That's super exciting. We've gone through a little bit of already. So the red house, we have our first image here. And also, I guess, just, you know, beginning, there's some wonderful images of this property. And so we're so thankful and lucky to have these images from various collections and the Historical Society. So that's something to really celebrate. Case study in community continuity and preservation planning challenges. Because while this is a celebration of this residence, this is also a discussion about some of the challenges in community preservation. So there we go. And then this, so this is in the 1930s. This is actually just after Anna and J.D. Owen moved into the Red House, not long before. So this is kind of how it's looking in the early decades of the 20th century, after a very long tenureship of multi-generational ownership by a single family stemming from Stephen Fish. So this is, you know, a great image of J.D. Owen and Buddy the dog, and the captions are named from what was scrawled on the back of the photographs. So, and then just the background here, which you'll see throughout, is the Beers Atlas from 1869, and this little tiny residence right next to the "and" is Fish Corner, Stephen Fish's house, or the heirs of Stephen Fish. And my daughter this morning told me, that is way too busy. It looks like a third grader made that PowerPoint, but this is the background that we have. So, so I talked a little bit about the program outline for today, so I won't really go through that again. But what I will say is a thank you. I'm very thankful to have been involved in this project. I feel really lucky and privileged. So thank you to the Fairhaven Historical Society, the Preservation Trust of Vermont, and also the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation, both of whom partially funded the study. So it's really a wonderful opportunity to have the chance to document this home and also become acquainted with Fairhaven, because this is the first work that I've done in this town, actually, and really, you know, in this very close region. This photo is from the collections of the Historical Society, and it's a very familiar intersection to many of you. You probably pick it up right away. Of course, the Red House, or the Stephen Fish House, is located right on the left-hand side of that photo. This looks like a largely pre-automobile photo we have here. Yep, circa 1900 or so, intersection of Main and Capitol Hill. And we'll talk a little bit about, you know, the development of Fairhaven and how this real sort of agricultural zone was steadily developed. You know, in the decades right before 1900, the development really marched up toward this area of town. So a bit of the project background. I became involved in this project after sort of the die were cast, so to speak, in terms of what was going to transpire with Stuart Shop. But from, you know, reviewing the project record and speaking with Victoria and learning about the project background, essentially Stuart Shop, which there had been a gas station, which we'll talk about a bit today, really from the very dawn of the automobile age, the heirs of Stephen Fish had actually leased a bit of their land to a very small filling station in the 1920s or so, laying the seeds ultimately of Stuart Shop, really. And there was a request for enlargement of a non-conforming use by combining their existing acreage with the house site next door. And as part of that request was the demolition of this residence and enlargement of the parking lot. This was approved by the Fairhaven Planning Commission in 2021, June 17th. there was an appeal filed. I also want to note that Stewart Shop did commission a study. There was a historic resource analysis done for this property on the part of Stewart Shop, and their architectural historian that they consulted with also found the property eligible for the National Register. There was an eligibility determination. But as we'll talk a little bit about later, there really wasn't a nexus for this project. That finding of potential eligibility really didn't translate to any specific threshold that Stewart Shop needed to cross, in that the Planning Commission approved, the appeal was settled. There was coordination with Stewart Shop regarding alternatives. I know a number of you are intimately involved in that coordination on how to avoid this outcome, but that failed to sort of culminate prior to demolition. I think at the moment that it was recognized that demolition was imminent, the importance of documenting this resource. You know, while it couldn't be saved, being able to get in there and really physically document and also contextually document for the record was a really important action for the Historical Society to take. So I'm really glad that that was able to come together. I came down on a very lovely fall day. I remember it was sunny and it was warm and it was really great, and documented the house. And what was so interesting, and I'll talk more about it later, the house was like a beehive of activity that day. I mean, there were people trenching, they were already, you know, laying out the new parking lot next to it. I mean, there was a very hectic pre-demolition construction scene going. I think the pad of the new gas station was being laid, but when I was inside the building documenting, it was so silent. Like, you're on this very busy intersection and you're surrounded by all of this hubbub, but there was a real feeling of stillness. It was just a wonderful feeling. And the afternoon light, as you know, the afternoon light in that residence was so wonderful. So I'll show some pictures from that day. The house was demolished October 18th, about a month after I documented. And then I developed a Vermont Architectural Resource Inventory form for the property that included that documentation from that day, as well as contextual research and other materials. And I think probably the form is available through the Historical Society, I'm sure. And then also it will be up on Vermont's Online Resource Center website, which is a wonderful resource. If you haven't gone onto that, that really is a compendium of documentation in Vermont. The forms can be a little clunky at the outset, just because it really is a sort of nuts and bolts, tell us about the building. But as you go through the pages, you'll sort of get to the story, essentially, and you'll see a lot of the documentation. This photo, so you'll see some changes as we progress through the 20th century. And that's the thing, is this house did change over time, you know, in really profound ways, but there was also a continuity there. So this is November 1948, and these are the Owens, I believe. It didn't say on the back, but this is the tenureship of their ownership, and the caption was, "While we were cleaning the lawn." And this actually seems like sort of a similar type of day as the day when I was there documenting, maybe a little bit later, thinking mid-October there. So you can see there's, instead of clapboards, there's the shingles, there's the shutters. We also have the circa 1940 addition that you can just see peeking around the back. The chimney has also been repaired from the 1930s Buddy the dog photo. So this one, Hidden in Plain Sight, kind of a provocative title, but I've always sort of wondered, you know, when I was looking at the Historic Sites and Structures Survey mapping, so this was done in the late 80s in Fairhaven, and was documentation of all of the buildings around Fairhaven that were historically significant or noteworthy. The Stephen Fish House was actually not documented as part of this. It was sort of a gap, right? So that's why I said hidden in plain sight, because there were many properties all around this residence that were documented as part of that historical study. And I think, you know, so essentially this was not a property that had been previously documented prior to this sort of whole unfolding of the demolition. And as I said before, there really was no regulatory nexus for consideration of the property primarily too because permitting really didn't involve either an Act 250 or at a federal level a Section 106 review, which sometimes is the trigger for considering a property formally. But what I kind of surmise is, you know, the overall kind of form and profile of this residence is a, you know, fairly a small, unassuming Cape Cod residence with this kind of salt box addition from 1940, with the clapboards added in the 1940s. I think this blended in at the time of this documentation as a sort of newer Cape Cod style that might have evolved in, you know, the early to mid 20th century. In some ways, I think this house just kind of went under the radar because we have these sort of two periods of the Cape Cod style. We have the legitimate Cape Cod house that, you know, was one of the early settlement houses in this area. And then we have the sort of new Cape Cod style, which was a really wonderful and, you know, classical thing to build in the, you know, middle decades of the 20th century. So very much surmising, but I think that might have been the case when they came through in the 1980s, that they were enamored with some of the very stylized Victorian era residences that were flanking this property. And this just kind of sitting next to the little gas station didn't get its due. So that's not pointing fingers at anyone, but it also is sort of pointing out that changing lenses over time in terms of how we analyze things or how we notice things, it's interesting to consider. I don't know, Devin, if you have any like thoughts on whether that may have been.
I think that's probably exactly what happened.
Yeah.
It's such an unassuming little building.
Right.
And there are many nearly identical 1940s, 50s houses
Right.
that look just like this one.
Exactly.
Yeah. Kind of got assumed that it was much newer.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so here we'll dig into the kind of, you know, history of the house. And I don't want to read lots of text, but I put some text in just to sort of, you know, serve as a guidepost. So you can listen to me and also read the text, or, you know, whatever works best. But really, you know, like many towns in Vermont, Fairhaven was, you know, initially established by charter in the sort of immediate, you know, post-revolutionary period. The 1779 charter for the town of Fairhaven, you know, really laid the initial foundations for what you know, see today in terms of establishing this community. 75 men were granted, you know, their rights to the town with the stipulation: plant and cultivate 10 acres of land and build a house at least 18 feet square, or have one family settled on each right within the term of 5 years. Or after the circumstances of the present war between Great Britain and America will admit settlement with safety. So, you know, there was that little asterisk there, okay? So we have all of these sort of initial grantees, and one of them here is our initial grantee. And I will say that, you know, doing the research for this earliest period is a little bit fuzzy, you know? So when you're doing your research and when you have your constraints in terms of your ability to sit in the town records, you know, for day after day after day, which would be really lovely, but it is challenging when you're trying to pull things out. So often what I do is I start with something I know, you know. For example, I knew that Stephen Fish had owned the house in the, you know, early middle decades of the 19th century. I worked backwards, you know, so I went into the town records and I started by looking at Stephen Fish. I dug backwards, and I also corroborated, because you have that very lovely history of the town of Fairhaven by Adams. Remind me of the first name.
Adam.
Exactly. And he was very detailed in his discussion of who settled what and where and sold to whom. So you start by corroborating and cross-checking and finding the right things. I will say that of all the research, you know, through the settlement history of the Red House, that earliest period from, say, you know, the initial kind of granting and the initial ownership to purchase by Stephen Fish, you could still do more research there. You could find more materials. But, well, I'll tell you what I found. So the Red House, and I'll go back and forth. Sometimes I say Stephen Fish House, sometimes I say Red House. I don't know what is the preferred. But either way, we'll just keep going with which one I choose. So Josiah Grant, who was one of the original proprietors of Fairhaven, There was a lot of land exchange at that period, no surprise. I mean, we obviously have our original sort of landholders who are, you know, people of means who are then sort of wheeling and dealing and selling and, you know, moving. So there was a lot of exchange in that early period. Almost immediately, Grant sold to Curtis Kelsey in 1780 a portion of his land. Kelsey had 300 acres in that sort of northeast corner of Fairhaven in the periphery. An 83-acre section of that land was deeded by Kelsey to his son Lyman Curtis in 1795. Lyman Curtis died in 1796, and the land actually went to his brother. It's a little bit fuzzy between 1796 and when we have really great hits again, but I am assuming that the Red House was developed during this period because by the 1820s, we have the property under the ownership of Olney Hawkins, and Olney Hawkins is married to the granddaughter of another very large landowner in that vicinity. So that's the other thing too, is there's so many interconnections between families in this time period where you had a lot of interchange. So we picked the property up with Hawkins, Olney Hawkins, who was part of a family that owned a lot of land in that vicinity. He conveys the farm, and it's called a farm. There's a farm to Joseph Warner. At this time, and that's where we have a great hit, that's this one up here, Hawkins to Warner. The farm was occupied by a tenant, John Parkhill. So there was a tenant farmer working on the property. By 1830, Joseph Warner conveyed it to his brother, John Warner. So we have this sort of moving through hands of this sort of agricultural assemblage, which we had sort of an 83-acre or so at the initial sort of conveyance from the breaking down of the 300 acres. And then we're moving, and by the time we get to Stephen Fish, who is a farmer who moved there in 1835, it had been whittled down to 50 acres. So there's a farm, we have the Red House on the farm, and we have the family of Stephen Fish assuming ownership in 1835. And Stephen Fish had been farming in West Haven prior to purchasing this property, and originally had been from Massachusetts. And that's the case with many of these Fairhaven settlers. Massachusetts, Connecticut, that sort of region was the real common strain. Stephen Fish owned the property through 1849 when he died. His wife, Lavina Fish, remained in the property, and she died in 1866. The property was conveyed down through them to the daughter, a single daughter, Rebecca Fish, who became a Whipple. Remained under the ownership of the Fish descendants until 1934. So we really have, that's the longest tenureship, and that's why obviously this house has remained the Stephen Fish house for such a long time, is that we had the Fish family really from 1835 to 1934 was the owner of the property. And these things, let's see, so this is one of the land records, and you're all obviously familiar with sometimes the very difficult nature of reading some of these land records in terms of the overall script and sometimes some of the fading, but that's sort of one of the examples. And then let's see, what do we have here? Okay, yeah, so this is about the estate of Stephen Fish. So this is the death of Stephen Fish and the sort of dissemination of his estate at the dwelling house of his widow, Lavina Fish. So these are just, you know, they're bits of archival materials that I've incorporated in here. Yeah, and then the other thing I'll say is, you know, I did write this quite some time ago, and it's sort of sad how you can forget details kind of quickly. So when I was reviewing this over the past week to remember, okay, what am I going to get up and say? Some details can get a little fuzzy. So if there's more questions or you'd like to know more, feel free to ask, and I'll try and I'll get back to you. Or also Very Record is a lot smarter on this than I am at this point, even though I wrote it. It's been a few years. So sometimes things can fade. So this is a really, really lucky sort of happenstance where you find one record that's really helpful, but then you sort of cross-check it with something else that you find, and it can make it really incredible. So this is a detail of the Burley sort of bird's eye vision of Fairhaven. So this is very zoomed in. Obviously, this shows the entire town in its full extent and is a wonderful resource. But this is from 1886. So right up here is Fish's Corner. So you can see the house, right? And then you see the barns. But you also see that while there is development sort of radiating up on this side, there is not development, further north. Similarly, there's nothing on that south side of the road. It's much more scantily developed in the 1880s period, and the sort of heart of the town really is off and down in here. But what makes this really great is there was also, and this was published in the local newspaper, and I think it was also in one of the manuscripts from the Historical Society. This is a reminiscence from Ellen Batchelder, who is the daughter of Stephen and Lavina Fish's daughter, Rebecca. So Stephen Fish is her grandfather. And it's really great how it corroborates what we see in this image. The farm adjoining the Estey farm on the west was owned by Stephen Fish, my maternal grandfather. The house looks now just as it did then, only there was a long, low kitchen and open woodshed. Opposite the home were a row of barns, one large barn, then a barn with a deep open shed, wide enough for 2 teams to stand side by side. Then 2 more large hay barns, then a lean-to for storing farm utensils. Grandfather owned the land on both sides of the road. In those old days, farmers had to keep good fences on the highway, and I have often thought that my grandfather must have been kept pretty busy just keeping his fences in repair on the roadside. And I love that we can have that, recollection, and then we can actually see those fences, right? Because sometimes you think, oh, there's this like air of the fanciful, and did this really exist in this way? I think it's pretty neat to look at those fences from the 1880s in that image and know that we're sort of getting that, cross-check from his granddaughter. All right, so Fairhaven grows, and this has a profound effect on this development site. So as you all know in a lot more detail than I, Fairhaven in that middle sort of period of the 19th century was really booming from the slate quarrying and from overall development and growth. So we have, a tremendous surge in population. So 1840, 633 people. By 1910, we're at 3,095. So decade over decade, we have more and more people coming into Fairhaven, more diversifying industry, more pressures on that sort of traditional kind of agricultural sphere that existed there. So we'll compare with, the Burley map, which we just saw, and then let's look at the Sanborn fire insurance map from 1929. Clearly, we have a lot more development on that sort of south side of the Capitol Hill here. We have more development moving up than we had before. And obviously look at the areas right around the Red House. We've got houses all along Capitol Hill here. So what's kind of interesting too is, in the newspapers at that time, there was a lot of concern over the lack of housing in Fairhaven. How are we going to house all these people? We need to have more real estate available, more development. So this is one of those articles about the lack of housing and the need for more housing, and it actually says efforts were made to buy the Batchelder property, corner of Dutton Road and Capitol Hill, but the price of $13,000 for the entire property or $9,000 for the house and an acre of land were thought too high, so the deal was not closed. So it was interesting because by this point in time, Stephen Fish's granddaughter, the Batchelder, she didn't live in Fairhaven. She actually lived in New York. So I think this was probably rented out. It was sort of underutilized. Oh, what a waste. We really need to develop this land. But it wasn't developed. So this was in 1927. Another interesting thing that I'll point out is on this fire insurance map, 1929, you can barely see this small little square that's actually right at the corner of Capitol Hill and Dutton, but that's actually a filling station. So very early on, they did lease land to Standard Oil to have a little filling station. So it's like really interesting to think about the historical sort of antecedent of the filling station that occupies the lot now. So that was just sort of an interesting aside that that was probably one of the earlier stations in Fairhaven and really on a very prominent corner. Okay, so this is just a bit more detail into this. Basically, this is material on the Batchelder estate when Eloise Batchelder died, who was the sort of last fish-related descendant, and it basically talks about what was sold at that time. So a wood lot in the north part of said town of Fairhaven, a corner lot, so-called, on the north side of North Main Street, that's the gas station, on the east side of Dutton Avenue in said town of Fairhaven, the red house and lot on the north side of North Main Street in the town of Fairhaven, the homestead and lot on the north side of North Main Street in said town of Fairhaven. So that was the entire large assemblage that was sort of from that Stephen Fish period, was part of her estate and was sold at that time for the first time out of the family. And then here's a little detail on the 1944 Sanborn map that just shows the filling station in a bit more detail. And then also Stephen Fish House, obviously the little garage here. And then we have a dwelling right next door. So, you know, think about the barns and the larger land and the wood lot. You know, by the time we're getting to the 1940s, that's over. And then this is actually just a little visual of one of the sort of initial filling stations that was there. This is 1937. At that time, it was Hewitt Service Station. So there you have the building as it was at that time. Oh, yeah.
I think it was Eloise, but when we were pulling down the paper in the dining room before we papered, in red lipstick, there was a name.
Wow.
And a date, and we can't find the pictures, but I was trying to remember the name. It was a woman's name, and I think it was Eloise.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah.
It was like really bright lipstick.
Yeah.
Which would have made sense in like the teens. or
Yeah,
20s.
yeah.
It was pretty cool.
Yeah,
If
very
you find the
floppery,
picture,
yeah.
I'll-
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's so interesting. Okay. Yeah, we, aside just finding things on the walls, we have a cottage in Michigan that's like great-great-great-grandfather built in the 1890s, but we were redoing some things. We had to take part of a chimney down, and we found this like pencil hand-drawn sort of profile of a 19th century like woman with this bun and her profile, and it was all lightly done, and it was like that same feeling of, wow, you know, who did this and when? Okay, so now we're in 20th century ownership. The Owens family are the ones who received it from the Batchelder estate. They owned the property through 1967. Owens went to the Durfees, and the Durfees owned it for quite some time as well. In 1988, Martha Durfee conveyed to Diane Gray, who we have here. And 1995, conveyed from Diane Gray to the Rookers. 2006, Rookers to Robert Wyman and Constance Rooker. So through all of that, you know, that kind of chain of ownership over time, the Red House was home to at least 10 successive occupants over its approximately 200-year existence. It's probably slightly more than 10, because I think there was that period in the 1800 or so time period when it looks like we had some tenant farmers, there were some different things going on. So we have a lot of ownership through this. So when we talk about fines, you know, different layers of the residents, that's a big chain to go through. And this is circa 1950, so I should say, and I kind of blasted through this, the Owens in their later period of ownership in the 1940s did some fairly substantial changes. So originally it was a very simple Cape Cod style sort of hall and parlor plan. They actually added on that sort of northern element that created the salt box line, where they had more living space, a bigger kitchen, bathroom. It basically enlarged the house some. There also were those sort of picturesque kind of mid-20th century additions of, okay, instead of the simple clapboards that we had before, we're going to do these shingles. We obviously have these shutters. We have the little entry. So it really did make this property, in a way, very much sort of up to date with the current sort of design in the 1940s. So then it sort of went under the radar, you know, a bit. So here is, like I said, there was the addition that extended the line, but this is, you know, essentially the overall form of this property. Circa 1800 Cape Cod style design with that hall and parlor sort of, you know, either side of the chimney have the main living spaces. And then this had, you know, at the second level, the two small bedrooms under the roof line. Post and beam built around an anchoring central chimney. Obviously that later addition was not post and beam, that extension to the north. As we talked about before, you know, this was a defining property type in Vermont's early settlement period. At least in my neck of the woods, we don't have a lot of them left, and I would assume that that's the same, you know, around the state. Obviously, that's a long period of time to travel. Yeah, you know, the building overall does reflect very strong integrity, even though we do have these sort of, you know, notable changes over time. Related to siding, there was substantial work on the foundation and in the basement. There was some chimney stabilization over time, obviously the salt box addition, but the core of the house, you know, very much remains. This is a lot. That's a lot of text. I'm not sure if it's a bit much. But basically what I wanted to also do in this presentation is, you know, talk a little bit about the National Register. The National Register of Historic Places, which is really what, you know, we're evaluating the significance of properties against, does have defined criteria. And within those criteria, they are qualitative, and there's a lot of sort of room for different types of properties. But essentially, you know, part of the Vermont Architectural Resource Inventory documentation was defining the significance. So in relation to the National Register, criterion A, which is really about historic development over time, trends, themes, the sort of big picture narrative of how a place develops. The Red House is certainly significant in that regard. It's very foundational to the development of Fairhaven. And then we also have criterion C, and criterion C is architecture, right? So when we actually look at the material composition of this building, is it telling us something significant about the development history of Fairhaven? And we can all say yes, absolutely. So that is the significant statement from, you know, my work. But essentially, that's when we're talking about the significance of a building, we're tethering it to these criteria. And I should add, just to be thorough, criterion B is about people. So that's sort of, is it connected directly to the productive activities of a person? And then D is really information potential. You know, can a property, through the information itself in the materials, present significance? And I should say D is typically related to archaeology in a way that's probably a bit more intimate than buildings. So we have A and C. So, you know, in terms of being an expert architectural historian, that's often what we're doing, is saying, okay, how do these properties actually relate to these criteria for significance? Integrity. So I've said this before, so I don't have to go through all of it, but there's also 7 aspects of integrity. So a building can be significant, but if it completely lacks integrity in terms of being able to convey its significance, often it will not be eligible. So you may have a significant property, but if it's lost too much of its physicality, that might undermine its ability to convey significance. So while I've already, you know, talked to a certain degree, there really is an essential integrity to the property when I documented it. You really do have the wood post and beam framing, the configuration of materials of the central chimney in that plan, the slate roofing materials, wide plank wood floors, overall building massing and design. So you certainly have a spectrum of other sort of elements in the property that evolved over time, but that didn't undermine that essential integrity. That's a lot, but basically I've bulleted, when we talk about the 7 aspects of integrity, location, and that speaks for itself. Is the building in the same place? Yes. Setting. Obviously the setting of the Red House is wildly different than the agricultural sort of hinterland setting of its development. However, you can still sort of interpret the way that the town developed around the property. I mean, there really is, you can learn from the sort of siting of the house how Fairhaven developed. So obviously setting's a bit compromised, but design, yes, you can read the overall sort of Cape Cod design. Materials, obviously there's been changes over time, but there are essential materials remaining. Workmanship, yes, the post and beam framing, the overall, as we can certainly see in some of the later pictures, that's all there. Feeling and association. You know, while it might have been buried to a certain degree, when you actually inspect the building, you can certainly find a very strong feeling and association with that development period. So let's see. Yeah, I think that sums it up for that slide. I should say, I do just want to add this one in, you know, that the changes over time can also be significant in and of themselves. You know, we don't have to have like an exact snapshot to that early colonial development period necessarily. There can be these layers that actually add significance. And this is, I think, when we talked on the phone last year, Diane, a quote, "I loved that house. We put so much work into it and knew those before us did too. It took a lot of work." You know, so that idea is that it's not really just this little snapshot in one time. It was the efforts of people through generations that, you know, added to the property as well. So now we're actually just going to do some scrolling through the house as it looked in September of 2021. So this is the main hall here, and this is actually a photo. I don't know, it didn't have a date on it, but it's actually quite, you know, amazing how you could see in my photo on the left a real, you know, overall continuity. So you can see the entry hall here, obviously the framing members on the ceiling. There's one of the doors, that's one of the earlier doors leading down to the basement. Obviously there's some changes over time. Look at, you know, our fixture here, the lighting fixture, this kind of slate surround on the fireplace, but then the fireplace structure itself, very much original. So you really have this sort of over layers. I guess we're jumping back to a few photos. This is comparing the sort of shed addition in the 30s with what ultimately came to fruition by the mid-century period. Here's another picture of John D. Owen sitting on the steps in 1934. The windows. So obviously you can look, these are certainly updated windows from the mid-20th century period. This is one of Walter's photographs, actually, because by the time I got there, there was the big mountain of soil in front of the house. So this was from the summer of 2021. This is when I came, September of 2021. They were at work. One of the other elements I haven't talked about yet is the trees, too. Those mature trees were really splendid, and obviously part of the house and its history. So seeing that tree, yeah.
Would stop and help us rake the leaves.
Yeah.
Especially Steffi's friend.
Yeah, I bet it was beautiful. Yeah, it was a beautiful tree. The plan. So I talked before about the addition in the mid-1940s. In the front, this is our original portion of the house. We have in the rear the addition. So that's kind of that extension of the main body of the house for 20th century living. So that is the overall setup. Entering, this is entering into the sort of main vestibule where you can go left or right into the hall and parlor. And I mean, obviously, I actually am always a little bit unclear, the hall versus the parlor. Devin, do you have like a quick, like, which is the hall, which is the parlor in terms of?
Basically, hall.
All right, so this is, we looked at this photo before, and the floors obviously were changed in the 20th century. Upstairs you have the wide plank floors. There's the central fireplace. We have the wainscoting around. Let's see. That's from removal of the hot water heater, potentially. They were at work. They were certainly taking things out of the property. Right.
Okay.
And here we have the other side, obviously oriented to the central fireplace. And then we have the basement level down here. There were also, as we just talked about, many layers of wallpaper. Looking to the northerly addition out the back through that sort of central area of the residence. Am I blocking? Sorry, I probably am. Again, we have layers. This is the modern-ish kitchen from the circa sort of mid-1940s period. So obviously we have these sort of different elements of the house. Maybe I'll...
Those cabinets, Norm Schauble built those. They were all cherry cabinets.
And here's the central stairway, and the rise on these stairs was quite something. You're basically summiting.
Opens your socks.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, you do not want to run down those stairs in slippery socks. Absolutely not. And here is that upstairs level. So looking up the stairs and then obviously seeing this massive chimney that is the sort of central anchor of the residence. And then if you look to the left, you can see the tapering sort of wall of the chimney. Obviously, it started out at a much more wide foundation and moving up through this. So the stairs are really summiting right up into there. And then take a look at the floors at this upper level, these very wide plank floors, two very cozy rooms.
You probably didn't know it, but in each one of the bedrooms upstairs, there was a one-stick pot-bellied stove. And it was the coolest, but Martha took those when she went. But my insurance company said, good, because you never could have used those and
Yeah.
burned down your house.
Yeah.
But it was really cool, and each one of those closets were
Oh,
one-stick
okay,
pot-belly,
okay.
Because we didn't have heat upstairs, did we, Steph? I mean, water would freeze.
Yeah.
We had big blankets and stuff.
Yeah.
I love that place.
The basement.
Yes.
So this is the central chimney here, and there's this kind of rubbled addition to that center part of the chimney, and all of the bottles were coming out. So I was with Walter, yeah, and there were all these bottles coming and crumbling out, and it seemed to me that's not necessarily my forte, is very precise dating, but they seem to be sort of early 20th century kind of in vintage. And then we do have, there's a concrete floor on this basement originally, and I'm fuzzy on which record or reminisce told me this. Originally, there was a small dirt basement under a portion of this residence, and in that period in the 1940s, the basement was expanded. This is a lot of slate. It's all machine cut slate though, so it does seem like obviously this basement has had quite a bit of work. But this is the overall state, and you can obviously see the framing elements of the floor above, and that portion of the chimney there that's kind of coming undone. Here's a detail. So these are just some sort of layered detail shots. This is the overall kind of the layering of the wallpaper. So throughout the house, you know, it's sort of these successive design choices by the occupants. We have the not original, we have earlier clapboards underneath the shingles as well. So when we look at, you know, J.D. Owen sitting on the porch, those were his shingle, or those were the clapboards from his time period. More detailed kind of layer shots. You know, we have, this is in the downstairs, some of the latch typologies on the doors. This on the stairs down into the basement. We've got some very kind of dated linoleum that's really interesting, that looks like quite early linoleum. Decorative choices in terms of doorknobs. We have the little kitchen pass-through with the kind of braiding decor around. These are all just choices that people made over time. And then this is the original, in the fireplace, one of the hooks that's on the wall of the fireplace. So just sort of some physical samplings. When I was there that day, they were trenching for the utilities, and the guys who were trenching said, "Wow, look what we found," and they handed me this sewing machine. So that was sort of interesting. I don't know. I mean, they might have. I'm not sure if you ever heard on any other finds. Yeah.
That was it. It was enough.
Yeah.
Well, when we were there, we had, one of the problems of the house that just kept, it was like the money pit. And at one point, everything was coming back into the road, into our house, the sewage and stuff.
Oh, gosh.
Into the tub and all that stuff. And there was a huge sinkhole. Remember when they had to dig that all up in Fairhaven? That was when we just got it.
It was like terracotta pipes.
It was terracotta
And
pipes.
it was trucks that were parking there to make deliveries at Stewart's.
Compressing. Oh.
And it crushed the pipes, and they were like, "Well, you're going to have to pay for that." And like, I just bought that. I'm a single mother. I'm like, "There's no way." And the townspeople came down and looked and said it was a town issue, so they fixed it for us.
Good.
But it was one of those one right after another
Right.
kind of
What's
thing.
going to pop up
But yeah,
next?
and they dug up stuff then too.
I bet. Yeah. And then Walter, do you want to tell us about this? Because this was something that you acquired, and
Yeah, this is a trunnel. A trunnel is a pin that's used to anchor the post of beam as it comes together. And as you can see, this is not something that is machine made. It's chopped and cut and scraped to fit a certain opening. And this came from the, I guess not the parlor area, but the living area. It's right here. This is it. And the interesting thing about it was that when the house was being torn down, and Maureen and I were standing there in the cold watching this thing being demolished, the gentleman who was in charge of the demolition came up to me and handed me this and said, "Would you like to have this as a commemorative?" No one had touched this for 200 years or more until it was put in. And it remained there for all that time until he had grabbed it and handed it to me. It's an interesting aspect of the story. We have it, and it will be on display if we ever get a museum.
thank you.
Do you want a little more history on those? Because I know how to do post and beam architecture. Usually the pins were made out of oak and were seasoned, so they were dry. And when they were driven into the beams with a pocket, that wood was generally wet. So when the beams dried, it would lock that pin in, so you couldn't move it. To get one of those things out is incredibly difficult. Usually they just resort to drilling it out to save it. But that was an old-fashioned technique for making sure that the frame itself did not move.
Yeah, such a elegant and compact way of having this immense longevity, you know, sort of
Metal was
centered
expensive,
around,
so it was
right.
Considerably easier and cheaper and faster, actually, to do it that way than it would be just to nail it.
Now, I am sorry to show, 'cause these are, I mean, I'm really thankful that you took these photos, Walter. But I think, you know, after just having such a multi-century story get flattened so quickly is just, it's horrifying. And it truly is, you know, the, first of all, workmanship that was inherent in this property, the materials, right? I mean, just the very materials and their strength. Again, I mean, it's just, the fact that this happened is a real tragedy. And having this sort of subsumed by the Stewart's Corner lot is, you know, truly just a, I guess I'm getting a little tangled up, but it is. So,
Okay.
Was there any insulation?
No,
No.
I can tell you about that.
Acorns.
Yeah, that was it.
Right.
When we painted that, when we got there, it was in such bad shape, and we went down to Abishans. And Mr. Miller, you know, I said, Mr. Miller, I've got to paint it. And he goes, oh, no, you can't paint that house. You've got to stain that house. So down the cellar he went, and he came up with like 6 gallons of god-awful, it was oil-based paint. And we painted that whole thing, didn't we? It was stain, and we painted that whole thing. And then we walked into the house, and you couldn't breathe because of the fumes. We had to stay at my parents' for like 2 weeks. It was terrible. There's no insulation. I can't remember if they tried to blow something in. What did they try to do?
I think at one point they talked about
Yeah,
trying to
that
do
paper
cellulose.
stuff, or, yeah.
But there was a
Cellulose.
rotten wall on the
Yeah.
outside that it could go into. But it was like, you could hear the squirrels go, or the chipmunks
Yeah.
go from the bottom. You could be like sitting downstairs in the dining room and then go upstairs and you'd hear them go all the way up and over. And because the upstairs
So we had
bedroom
cats.
was shaped like that, you'd hear them go up and down and you're laying. Like, it was like,
Little pitter patter.
there definitely wasn't any insulation because it was a free run. Like it wasn't, there were no jogs. It was like.
And the fuel, the first winter we were there, because I asked Martha, I said, how's the fuel, you know, because I'm single and I'm trying to do my money and stuff. She goes, oh, no problem, no problem. And my Uncle Joe was the one that took care of their furnace and all this stuff. Well, the first, they came and they filled up the tank. I'm like, oh, this isn't so bad. But then guess what? The next week they had to come and fill it up again. So I ended up renting a room so I could just pay for the fuel, because it was a killer. But again, we loved it. It was all good. Yeah, no
Right.
insulation. No.
So I think, the sort of conclusion to this is, I wanted to share the story of the house and the overall historic context for development. I wanted to show some of the overall material images of the house and the change over time and the characteristics. But then I think also, thinking about going forward for the people in Fairhaven, really thinking proactively about preservation and how to maintain this tremendous building stock you have, because while I'm far less familiar with the overall dimensions of Fairhaven, every time I'm coming down to this community, I'm just struck by the array of beautiful buildings and spaces and planned landscapes. And I mean, it's a wonderful community with such an amazing built environment heritage. So thinking a little bit about preservation strategies, and when I was thinking about it, and I'm really glad Devin's here because I think Devin could talk in greater detail than me about some of those community-based strategies. I actually saw that your contact is the CLG contact for, right. So that's sort of something maybe we could talk a bit about, but then also just overall cultivation of awareness and involvement and celebration within the community of the building stock in Fairhaven. So thinking about community-based preservation, because as I said at the beginning, one of the real sort of defining elements of this, the unfurling of how this occurred, was that there was no break on what happened. I mean, essentially, when the Planning Commission approved this development, there was really no other way of altering the way that the project unfurled. So thinking about how local communities can become more involved in the preservation process, the Certified Local Government Program does seem like something worthy of consideration and worthy of thinking about as a community. Essentially, it gives local communities sort of more of a say in the preservation process by having a sort of defined list of attributes that can help guide projects. So essentially, this is the sort of overall statement for the Vermont CLG program. Basically, the Vermont tradition is preservation. The Vermont tradition is using what you have and using it well, and really having local community involvement in our built environment landscape. So having sort of preservation opportunities at the community level, this can be a really good conduit for that. So there are certain parameters, and again, I'm actually going to hand this over to Devin, I think, to maybe talk a little bit more about, but there are sort of requirements for becoming a CLG. So one is establishing a qualified historic preservation commission. So Fairhaven obviously has a planning commission. the community of Fairhaven does not have a historic preservation commission. And this is something you all probably know a backstory on this far more than I, but thinking about that sort of parameter is one of them. Enforcing appropriate state or local legislation for the designation and protection of historic properties. In most cases, this is done in the form of a local ordinance. Moving down, maintaining a system for the survey and inventory of local historic resources. So one thing, as I talked earlier in the presentation, the Vermont Historic Sites and Structures Survey from 1989, that is a quite robust list of properties, had the gap for the Red House. Also, it's somewhat out of date. So thinking about how do we have a process for identifying those resources in Fairhaven? How do we have a inventory of properties? So that's something to think about as well. Provide for public participation in the local historic preservation program, including participation in the National Register process. Follow any additional requirements as outlined in the state's procedures. So that's very sort of jargonese. I'll send, because it's not helpful having a PowerPoint that has a link you can press, because clearly you can't press that. So I'll send a follow-up.
We've actually looked into this, and it, from our point of view and the point of view of the town manager, the sticking point is the Historic Preservation Commission, because it's very specific about the kinds, the qualifications that people can be on that commission. And that was the sticking point. We just didn't feel like we could get past that. I mean, it's definitely worth revisiting, but we did spend quite a bit of time with the town manager on that right after this whole fiasco happened.
Yeah, and I think that's perfect for Devin to jump in. Yeah.
So I'm Devin Coleman. I'm the state architectural historian at the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation, so the state office. And one of the program areas I oversee is the Certified Local Government Program. We call it CLG. It's a horrible name. It tells you nothing. What is a certified local government? It tells you nothing about that, but the feds came up with it and we're stuck with it. So basically, it's a certification for the community that says you have made a commitment to local historic preservation. And the intent is to, for many decades, preservation was top-down. The feds would tell the states what to do, and the state would tell the community what to do. And so by certifying a local government, it's trying to put the power at the local level and say, you guys know your community. You know what's important in your community, so you decide how you want to protect it. And then that funnels up to the state. We help coordinate the program. And then the big benefit is that if you are designated as a CLG, the National Park Service at the federal level gives grants to CLG communities for preservation activities. So that's the big benefit of becoming a CLG community. But backing up from that, the first thing to do is establish a Historic Preservation Commission. And that can be done without becoming a CLG. So there are plenty of towns in Vermont that have a local Historic Preservation Commission, but are not CLGs. I always ask them, why not become a CLG and get the money? That's up to them. But establishing that Preservation Commission is really important because that is an official municipal body. Unlike the Historical Society, which is a nonprofit organization, that's not a dig against the Historical Society, but it does say something when the community establishes a specific municipal entity, similar to having a Conservation Commission or a Parks Commission. Having a Historic Preservation Commission lodges historic preservation in town government and gives a little more weight to that. And it's a resource for the Planning Commission to refer to if there's a question that comes up like, how should we treat this historic building? They want to swap out all the windows with new vinyl windows. The Preservation Commission can offer input and guidance on that. And then once you have a commission, the logical next step is become a certified local government, apply for grants, that the commission can carry out to do things like local survey and documentation, National Register nominations, oral history interviews. Generally, if you can think of it, we can find a way to fund it. so the CLG is a really opens up a lot of doors there, because it's limited just to designated communities. There are only 17 in the whole state. So you've narrowed it down from 251 towns to 17 for this pot of money. So it's worth looking into. And we can certainly work on the qualification requirements.
Good.
Happy to talk about that.
Meet those qualifications.
Yeah, because it's Vermont. Very few towns have a professional archaeologist. You know, so we can work around that. So I'd certainly be happy to talk with the town more about that.
Debbie, can I ask both for you and Polly? I was intrigued at the very beginning when Polly said the red house was hidden in plain sight. I'm sure we have other places hidden in plain sight. How do we find them?
So by doing projects similar to this one, but maybe not to such a granular level, but the research and sort of casting a wide net, asking people, because I think when that initial survey was done in the 80s, if that surveyor had sat down with historical society members, or, you know, there's usually 2 or 3 old timers in town who know everything, you know, sat down with those people and said, what are the important historic buildings in town? The Red House would have been called out. So a lot of times it's just that initial sort of putting the feelers out, some articles in the local paper, you know, what do you know that's out there, and then gathering that and then sorting through the details of what's actually significant.
It might even be helpful to print out like a large-ish scale, one of these siting maps, and then a current map just on a light board or on a window, as an initial like swath of like, well, what was where?
Yeah.
And just see like, oh, okay, well, that's just a little bit off. Maybe, you know, one of these surveys was a little off, and that is something to look at.
Yeah, comparing a historic map to a present-day map, and you can even overlay them digitally now and toggle the brightness and contrast of each one and see where things are.
It's just very interesting that 80s study, there were so many buildings in Fairhaven. I mean, you think, oh,
Yeah.
wow, this is so comprehensive.
Yeah.
And yet they missed one of the oldest houses in town.
But
I feel like I was ignorant to that too, because when I bought it from Martha, I assumed that it was on the historical registration, because she told me, all I know that you have to do is make sure this house is always red.
Yeah, that was,
And that, you know what I mean? So that, I'm like, oh, but we had a lot going on.
yeah.
Yeah, it was the sort of internal received wisdom, right?
You know, and then when we were selling it, they're like, no, this has never been on the historical registration.
But that was in her closing statement.
That was her
Closing on the house,
Yeah.
was you have to make sure it's part of, and I think she did say it's
Yeah.
part of the historical,
Yeah, so I
whatever,
assumed that, you know, like I said.
and had that poem. Did something.
Yeah, and I think, you know, to your question, Victoria, about, you know, how to, you know, make sure that there aren't others is, you know, you all are probably the most knowledgeable, you know, people around the built environment. So really thinking about, okay, as I'm driving around my community, as I'm walking around my community, as I'm thinking about, you know, what's this building, what's that building, I think that knowledge is there. So maybe even just intentionally in, you know, one of your meetings or having a special meeting where you're really sort of sitting down and brainstorming for a bit, let's check out, you know, A, what's on the inventory already, and B, what are these buildings that we're, you know, going by all the time? And, you know, that's something in sort of architectural history parlance. There is this concept of the windshield survey, where you're essentially at a high level cruising through areas, noticing whether it's a back barn or a carriage house or, you know, a filling station. I mean, there's all these things you can think, let's think about that. Because then you also get back to the integrity question, where there may be hidden gems that are very well hidden, but if they're so well hidden, if the integrity is so undermined at some point too, they may remain hidden forever, you know, to be honest. So I think just thinking collectively about your physical footprint at your day-to-day level, I think would be helpful.
The other piece I want to point out is that even if this house had been documented and listed in the state register or even the national register, it still would have come down. Because the regulatory trigger is not historic designation. It's whether the project is using state or federal funding, licenses, or permits. The way to deal with that is to have a local municipal level preservation ordinance. And actually that is the single strongest and best means of protecting historic properties, is at the local level. Because the state and federal regulations are all, they don't really have any teeth to them. They set up a consultation process to talk about alternatives, look at possible solutions. But at the end of all that, it's up to the state or federal agency to say, thanks, but we're still going to tear it down. The local ordinance can have real teeth and can say, no, you actually cannot do that. So that's something to think about. And local ordinances are geared to the community to which they apply. So you cannot simply look at, well, what does Rutland have? We'll copy that. No, Rutland City is totally different from Fairhaven. So it really has to be, and also tailored to the comfort level of the community. Do you want to get down to the level of regulating paint color? No, don't do that. Some communities do, don't do that. Think bigger picture, you know, material alterations, additions, demolitions. So there is a kind of a happy medium that can be found to ensure that these.
I just want to reassure our members, even though we don't have a planning commission and we don't have an ordinance, we do now have somebody on the planning commission who is alert to everything that comes to the commission to kind of alert us to, oh, maybe we should be weighing in on that. So that's a little tiny step.
Yep.
I think that's a big step. Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm so glad you were here to talk to those things. So, and again, the ordinance is kind of one of those ingredients of the CLG as well. So that's one of those building blocks to that. So kind of backing up from that kind of, you know, avenue to explore, I guess I was just thinking about, you know, overall discussion. I'd be happy to take questions, but I was also thinking, you know, short of establishing, you know, a commission and going down the CLG process, so much of the work of historical societies is also cultivating a care and an awareness in the community at large. I know I live in a small community, smaller than Fairhaven, Craftsbury, which is quite small, and I'm a new board member on the Craftsbury Historical Society, and our historical society was at peril of disappearing last year because they were down to 2 board members. So we're sort of reviving to a certain degree. But I think that is, you know, one issue is how to get the good work and the passion of the Historical Society out to a larger community. So instead of, you know, me talking at you about that, I was just thinking a little bit of discussion around, you know, because I'm not as familiar with the ongoing efforts, but thinking about, you know, how to get the word out to people in the community, students, you know, really having younger people made aware of the assets that the community holds. So I don't know whether anyone has any thoughts on sort of, you know, what you've been thinking about as a board in terms of just general public outreach and awareness, like whether what happened with the Red House did catalyze more interest or more kind of awareness around the built environment. Can you speak to that at all?
Anybody's willing to jump in? Well, I know when we were going through this, we all had lots of contact with community members who said, "Oh, how could they do that? Why couldn't you stop that?" And you know, yet you could see how difficult it is for us to get board members and volunteers. So I'm sure that's true across the board. But there was a lot of concern in the community, and maybe we can tap into some of that concern when it comes to developing an ordinance or a commission. I don't know.
One of the most interesting things for me was that Stewart Shops was ready to give us the red house. They in fact did. That's what he said. It's yours. All you have to do is come up with the money to pick it up, move it, find a place to put it, dig the foundation, and plant it. Well, obviously, we couldn't do that in a short frame of time. But what I found to be most interesting is the community reaction. The internet, for what it's worth in Fairhaven, literally blew up against us. There were people who thought we were opposed to Stewart's Shop, which we weren't. Absolutely not. We were not against them. They were trying to be helpful and yet expand their business. We're not against progress. We just want to preserve the past. So we were attacked on the level of, well, if it's your house, you're making money on it. We're a 501(c)(3) charitable organization. We're a charity. We're not making any money. Nobody makes money here. That I found, in my experience with it, was perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the whole deal. There just wasn't that much understanding of what was really happening. And yet we were trying to convey as much as possible to people, literally. We also have in Victoria and Seal some very good connections with Castleton University. And they frequently, well, not that frequently, but occasionally, they will have students participate in a variety of different projects, all of a historic nature, helping us get the job done. So we are outreaching there whenever we possibly can. And we found that to be really worthwhile.
Yeah.
Giving us an opportunity to communicate, giving them an opportunity to get their hands dirty doing stuff with us. And we've also received terrific support, I think, from the state, obviously from the Preservation Trust. So, you know, from our standpoint, we've done the best we can with what very limited membership we have.
Yeah.
Which is a good segue to thank Devin for his financial support for this, because we never would have been able to get this very done with Polly. So thank you very much, Devin, and your organization.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I think that, you know, is a good closing note, that kind of false dichotomy of, you know, preservation is not, we're opposed to, you know, X, Y, and Z. It's really celebrating the built environment heritage and the stories that have, you know, preceded us and surround us. So I think, you know, taking that away today, obviously we explored the story of this property. We talked about, you know, some sort of exacting routes that might be very worthy of pursuing, thinking about having more local voice in this, you know, through the CLG process, through developing, you know, an idea around the commission or potentially an appropriate ordinance. But it really is also that community involvement piece, you know, getting the word out and having, you know, activities and programs that reach a cross section of people. I know one of the things that helped the Craftsbury Historical Society was during COVID, when everybody was sort of home and not doing anything, we had all these neat creative things bubble up. Somebody made a fun little sort of scavenger hunt walking tour of the common and the immediate environs for kids, because people really couldn't be inside doing things together. So it was a very like family-oriented, kid-oriented program where they were learning about, you know, the space around them. And so many kids in Craftsbury are like, we live in the middle of nowhere, we have nothing. And it introduced them to, wow, these are the real foundations of the community. And I think that shaped a lot of parents and kids in terms of a little bit of an understanding. So it's interesting because small efforts and fun efforts can really pay dividends and build over time of just the public awareness piece and the support piece. So I think I'll leave it there. If there's questions, I'm happy to answer more questions.
I don't know that this is a question, but I do know that when I went through the grade school here, in 4th grade, it was town history, and in 7th grade, it was state history. And that made such a huge impact and such an amazing imprint too, in that term of like, I live in the middle of nowhere. And then it was like, even afterwards, like thinking about, you know, the Minutemen mustering on the green and the town that you like. These are very exciting things. And that's one of those capture places, right, where if you can get kids, and it's a lot of work, there's no doubt about that, but interested in that, and then their parents follow. And then those are voting members, or might be, and then if you could have a situation where a child is like, well, Dad, why are you gonna let that get torn down? Like, that's a very different give than people that are seen as being on the outside of these other parts saying these things. And I remember reading, because Mom, I'm in New York now, and Mom had told me about what was happening with the house, and I went on I don't even have Facebook, but I went on to read like the stuff about the house. And I was like, what? This is so mean. Like, why are you being jerks about? And one of them was like, there's nothing left in there anyway. And I was like, who are these people that are this mean to be like, you know, going after a historical, like, talk about low-hanging fruit? Like, it's just
We're
so.
actually going into the 4th grade class this spring.
Oh, great.
In February. And so if anybody wants to join us, we need participants. We want to make it as, you know, interactive as possible, so.
Oh, that's excellent.
Volunteers.
Just, we've been going through the same drill in Hubbardton. I mean, most towns do this, but one of the things that was done in Hubbardton, which was helpful, was issues like this were included in the town plan. And from a legal standpoint, believe it or not, that actually has traction with state and with entities who are trying, you know, come in and have to go through a development review board or whatever. But if it's in the town plan, it gives you the potential to have some traction.
Right, and then obviously you have more weight with the planning commission if you have an identified facet.
We always have a board member from the select board who's on the planning commission, who's also in the historical society, so that there's a three-way communication. One of the things you did here, it hadn't occurred to me, was just really publishing those old town maps is incredibly useful for tracing down what existed and what exists now.
Yeah.
I have a lot of that stuff. I used to collect town maps, but that's, I mean, even something like that as a document can go into a town plan, so at least it gives you a starting point.
Yeah, I mean, you know, yeah, there's the cesspit of the internet sometimes, which is, you know, really mean people on Facebook. But the great part of the internet, you know, to a certain degree is obviously all of these town maps have existed, you know, for a long time since their creation. But the digitization of so many records is actually a very powerful tool because, you know, a lot of the work that I did was here, but it is amazing the access we have to very high quality images that really can tell a story over time. Well, thank you all very much. And thank you I'm so happy to have been involved and I'm so happy to have had the opportunity. So thank you very much.
Thank you.